The president of Mexico is the head of state and head of government in Mexico's presidential system. The president is elected for a 6-year term, one 6-year term, no possibility of re-election. That is known as the sessenio. President is elected by a plurality electoral method whereby whoever gets the most votes wins. And the president, as head of state and head of government, is in charge of not dictating, but setting the tone for foreign policy, being able to initiate legislation, creating federal agencies is a significant power for Mexico's president. Historically, it was the most powerful institution in Mexico by a long shot. During the period of pre-hegemony from 1929 until 2000, it was very much a dictatorial position in a soft authoritarian way, if you will. There was very little opposition that could be mustered. The PRI controlled the legislature. The PRI controlled all the gubernatorial spots. And in fact, the president had a great amount of power to manage who was going to be nominated for and winning those positions as well. So economic reforms have reduced the power of the presidency in Mexico. Nothing more, though, has reduced the power of the Mexican president than multi-party Mexico. Ever since 1997, when the PRI lost its majority in the legislature, there has been an effective block on the presidency, or a check on power in any case. And so as the past few Mexican presidents have found out, it's very difficult when you have a legislature that is not going to go along with you in Mexico's multi-party system. Usually with representation from 3 major parties, it's very difficult to gain a majority. Morena, currently the party of the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has a plurality in both houses right now, though, the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. So AMLO should not have the problems that recent Mexican presidents have had. And we shall see how his sessenio does in fact play out. The Dedazo, again, out now. I still think that we screw this up on the exam. This is no longer in play. This was old school PRI until 2000, where the pre-president would tap a successor who would then run for president and win. But the Dedazo is no longer in play for Mexico on the whole, although Peña Nieto seemingly tried to tap his successor in 2018. But not a Mexican sensation, historically a pre-principle. Legislatively in Mexico, we have a bicameral national legislature. You have the Chamber of Deputies as the lower house. You have the Senate as the upper house. The Senate consists of 128 members who serve 6-year terms. They are all elected every 6 years. So every time there's a presidential election, there is a Senate election as well, as there was in 2018. The Senate election occurs when you have 32 subnational units in Mexico, 31 states plus the federal district. Each state votes for a particular party, or each resident, in a state votes for a party. Whichever party gets the most seats whichever party gets the most votes in a particular state, that party gets 2 seats in the Senate. Whichever party takes second in a particular state, they get 1 seat from the state in the Senate. And then there's a national party list vote with a 2% threshold to reach the 128 level member. So 2 members from each winning party in each state, 1 member of each second place party in each state, and then a national party list. 2% threshold is how the Mexican Senate is selected. And remember our Senate rule of thumbs, like we've talked about on the other countries: upper house, federal, state. You can always be sure, or at least be relatively sure, that they will be in charge of, or at least responsible for, the foreign policy piece in the legislature and judicial confirmations. And Mexico's is no different in regard to that. The Chamber of Deputies is the lower house in Mexico. It consists of a combo of plurality and party list voting, as does the Senate. So if you get a question, both houses consist of plurality and party list voting. In Mexico, the Chamber of Deputies involves 5 regions in Mexico, in which the members have 40 seats apiece, and you have a 2% threshold in each of those 5 regions, and so you have 200 seats determined by a party list vote with a 2% threshold via those 5 regions, 40 seats apiece, and then the other 300 seats are decided in an SMD plurality electoral method. So plurality in party list, that gets us to 500 in the Chamber of Deputies. The Chamber of Deputies is elected every 3 years. So that is the term for the lower house. Until just a few years ago now, in the 2014 reforms, there was no consecutive reelection allowed. And so in the legislature, there was no way to serve in the Chamber of Deputies or the Senate and then continue on for a second term. You had to sit out one. It wasn't widely done. So in a lot of cases, there was a lack of expertise in the Mexican legislature, and there was a lack of continuity. The goal, of course, was to prevent corruption and long-term sitting members to just be there. But now there has been consecutive reelection allowed, 2 terms in the Senate, 4 terms in the Chamber of Deputy. The PRI did dominate for decades. It was a rubber stamp. The PRI had a majority in the legislature from 1929 to 1997. Not today, of course. Since 97, there has been no legitimate majority, although Morena currently is loving their majority in the Chamber of Deputies, and with coalition has a majority in the Senate. But divided government seems to be the likely pattern for Mexico in the future, or at least the near future. And the PRI and PRD got absolutely slammed in the 2018 elections, especially the PRI, who had been the hegemon for so many decades. The PRI was decimated in the 2018 elections in both houses, as well as the presidential race. Judicially in Mexico, what we need to know, it is a code law system, and they do have a Supreme Court that does have the power of judicial review. The court has rarely used that power in the past, especially during the time of pre-hegemony. 8 of 11 judges are needed to affirm that principle, so you need a supermajority. The courts historically have lacked independence. First, it was pre-corruption. It's turned into both political corruption now and corruption from the cartels. The rule of law is very weak in Mexico. And the reforms that they passed in 2008 and got implemented about 10 years later in 2017 are just kind of getting underway. The center of it all was to make Mexico's trials more transparent, more open, less corrupt. So they instituted a U.S.-style open adversarial trial system as opposed to what had been taking place before, which was much more behind closed doors and not open, not transparent, and waiting for the results to be shown now over the last, or after a matter of years. The reforms of 2014, I already mentioned one of them. It was the consecutive reelection in both houses. This was meant to offset some gridlock, that the president's party would be able to form a coalition with, quote, political groupings in the legislature. The National Electoral Institute would replace the Federal Electoral Institute, so there would be a new national body there to shore up things and modernize the IFE. And then Mexico already had a law in place where 30% of legislative candidates had to be women, but the 2014 reforms made it so that 50% of legislative candidates have to be women. That is why you see a better representation of women in the Mexican legislature than you do in, say, the UK or some of the other countries. Election 2012, this is really out of order, but we're going to go with it because it was right here, and I'll get back to that. But Enrique Peña Nieto won in 2012 after 12 years of PAN rule, and Peña Nieto of the PRI won with 38% of the vote. You had a disillusioned public after the PAN, after the presidencies of Fox and Calderon. So Josefina Vázquez Mota, who was the first major female candidate in Mexican presidential history, took third place, and AMLO is the gentleman who took second for the second consecutive presidential election, representing the PRD here, 31.5% of the vote, not nearly as close as it was last time, but AMLO did do better in this election than a lot of people had anticipated. The PRI got a plurality in both houses in this case, but Peña Nieto's presidency got off to a rocky start, and part of that was due to the protest movement known as Yo Soy 132, good example of civil society in Mexico. This was the group that accused the PRI of vote buying, a media bias, illegal campaign spending on part of Peña Nieto in his campaign. Yo Soy 132 formed to protest the imprisonment of 131 students in Peña Nieto's Mexico state several years prior. Eventually, though, the Federal Electoral Tribunal validated the results, and despite the fact that this civil society group popped up and did very well from a publicity standpoint, Peña Nieto was confirmed as the president. The PRI itself, from a presidential standpoint, from a party standpoint, historically was the hegemon. We've talked about that. They used clientelism, co-optation, corporatism, lots of C's involved here, very much clientelistic, where you had positions given based on loyalty to people. Remember that the Camarilla was the Mexican politicians' clientelistic network of support. The Camarilla, the Mexican politicians' support group, giving people, a group of people, positions based on loyalty, who would then move up with him or her as they moved up the ladder. The pre-co-opted groups as well, informally giving them benefits to try to bring them into their support fold rather than opposition. And Mexico's PRI consistently used corporatism as a centerpiece of what they did, get those unions on their side and to remove opposition and keep the workers and the businesses and so forth and the military on the side of the party. The PRI also used threats and violence at times. They used fraud at times, and that was not always needed. Relatively soft authoritarian, Tlatelolco notwithstanding. But there was a use of rewards along with some harsher measures to maintain power when they needed it. The fraud, the cheating, we talked in class about stealing ballot boxes. We talked about the election of 88 where the plug was pulled. We talked about adding a zero onto the end of the vote total in certain areas, carousel voting, and so forth. So all of those would play out. Ideologically, the PRI is, above all, they were always nationalist. They were Mexico sovereignty. They were the party of the revolution. Centrist, center-right potentially party, but ideologically hard to pin down. Pragmatic, anti-clerical, and really in favor of state-led capitalism and economic nationalism on the whole until the 1980s, when structural adjustment led to the implementation of economic liberalization, and you had the neoliberal change to the PRI in that way. Their support today tends to be older people, less educated, more people from rural Mexico, and for a long time they have been the party that was able to compete everywhere in the country, and that they were, the PAN does well in the north, the PRD does well in the south in Mexico City, or did anyway, and the PRI could compete everywhere. They did get hit hard, though, in 2018, and so they will be doing some recalibrating and rethinking after that election. And as we said, Peña Nieto did win the presidency in 2012. I mentioned the Dedazo earlier. This is the semi-Dedazo that Peña Nieto gave to Jose Antonio Meade, as kind of nailing him down as the presidential nominee for the PRI. He did not do well in the election, however. The PAN, or the National Action Party, was the 1930s creation. They splintered from Lázaro Cárdenas's PRI after Cárdenas was doing his devoutly socialist works between 1934 and 40. The party today is Mexico's traditional conservative party. They are more right-wing, free market favored. They favor greater relations with the Catholic Church. And their support today comes from the northern states. It comes from people who support economic liberalization, those who are more socially conservative, those who are, in a lot of cases, urban, and upper middle class in a lot of cases as well. There's not one, individual way to do it, but you can always go pro-Catholic Church economic liberalization for the PAN. Vicente Fox was the first PAN president, and he was elected in 2000 in a landslide. It was the first pre-loss of the presidency since 1929. And Vicente Fox, the big 6'4", charismatic former Coca-Cola executive, former governor of Guanajuato State, big successful campaign, and he excited people. It sounded like that the people were going to get a president who was going to get things done, and they were going to break away from some of the corruption, some of the pre-stagnation and so forth. Fox promised better ties with the United States. He would reform land from an indigenous standpoint. He would clean up corruption. He would battle drug trafficking. And he would be a pro-business president who would stimulate Mexico's economy. And Fox, good intentions. He got off to a rough start. There was an experience. He had a tough time getting his cabinet set up and getting the early stages of his government going. And then 9/11 happened, and that really hurt his effort to promote immigration reform with President Bush. So that was tough. And the PAN really got beaten badly in 2003, which made his life more difficult, and lame duck for a significant period of his sessenio. Vicente will come into play later on, of course, when we talk about foreign policy and the wall. Felipe Calderón won a very, very close election over AMLO in 2006. It was about 36.6% to 36.1%. AMLO led in this election until weeks before, when he had a series of missteps, and business leaders got behind Calderón, fearing that AMLO would steer Mexico into the Hugo Chavez kind of scenario that they had seen previously in Venezuela. The drug violence absolutely marred his term. He used the military to battle the drug cartels, and this spilled over brutally into society, like we talked about. The corruption and drug violence went through the roof again. 80,000 people killed probably by Mexican drug violence during Felipe Calderón's time in office. So that will always be the definite black mark against him. Immigration reform didn't get done, and corruption still plagues the Mexican state. So 2 consecutive PAN presidents in between 2000 and 2012. The Democratic Revolutionary Party was the traditional third party beginning in the 1980s. This was a populist party founded, socialist and leftist, and this was because the PRI had moved to economic liberalization in the 1980s. So you had a splinter party formed to the left. PRD did very well for several election cycles with younger voters, those who lived in Mexico City, the southern and central states, and they had a strong support base in Mexico City. Like I said, Obrador, the current president, very nearly won the presidency in 2006. He ran again, like we said, and lost again in 2012. And the PRD was a relatively successful left-wing party. Then the fallout happened with AMLO after the 2012 election. AMLO then goes out and formed Morena, and that has kind of decimated the PRD today. The PRD and the PAN ran an alliance candidate in 2018, which was unique because you have a left-wing and a right-wing party. That was him, and Ricardo Anaya did not do terribly well in the election. There is your current president. It is AMLO. He formed the National Regeneration Movement, or Morena, in 2014 as a left-wing alternative to the PRD after he was disgruntled with the PRD, and the party and AMLO, having had their fallings out, split, and AMLO, being the charismatic guy that he was and the big name recognition, was able to garner a bunch of support, and lots of disillusionment with the PRI, lots of disillusionment with the PAN, and AMLO won the presidency in a landslide in 2018, and there you see him with Benito Juarez looking over his shoulder. There's AMLO and his left-wing counterpart, Jeremy Corbyn, in London as they are enjoying themselves. AMLO and promises and reality, those are two different things. And of course, on the campaign trail, it's easy to promise big things that cost a lot of money, and then you get into office and you realize that it's going to be tougher than that. He had promised cash grants for young people to help them get up and off their feet, higher pensions for retirees, to give price supports for farmers. He was going to provide loans for small businesses, get the soldiers off the street in the drug war and put it in the hands of the police, tackle corruption on the whole. A lot of this stuff hasn't happened yet as of May of 2019, but again, relatively early into his term, but he's already backtracked on several of these just out of sheer economic and security necessity. The pre-intensive care after the drubbing, that is the other big story coming out of the election of 2018. One, of course, was the election of AMLO. The other was that the got beaten down very, very badly, and they are having to rethink exactly where they are because they have never done this poorly in an election before.